Not sure who has host.
Oh, it says now.
I do, apparently. We're recording.
Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our second edition of our most recent K-State Research and Extension Cattle Conversation Series. For those of you that are just joining us, this is our kind of our third installment of this virtual series. It's a collaboration with multiple research and extension districts throughout central Kansas. And so I just want to introduce a few people that have been kind of on the planning committee and team with the planning of this event. We've got Justine Henderson. Justine is the livestock agent for the Central Kansas District. Lish Bohr, she's our generalist of the crew, our ag agent in the Cottonwood District. Myself, Clinton Laughlin, I'm the livestock agent for the Midway District. Rachel Brook, Rachel is the livestock agent for the Phillips Rooks District. And our newest member of the team, Blair Todd, the livestock agent for the Post Rock District. So again, I want to thank this outstanding group of people for all their help in planning this series, and want to say thank you for those of you tuning in today to learn about our most recent topic. If you're joining us on Zoom today, feel free to ask a question. And so if you're using Zoom for the first time, you'll see a chat box icon that is located at the bottom of your screen. And so click on that and type in your question, and one of our team members will see that pop up and make sure that our speaker today will get that question answered for you. If you're watching today or watching this recording at a later time and you would like to ask a question, please feel free to email those questions to me, Clinton Laughlin, and that's my email there, cllaughlin@ksu.edu. Okay. And at this time, I would like to call on one of my teammates to introduce our speaker today.
Good morning. I'm Alicia Bohr, and I am honored to introduce Dr. Alison Crane. She was raised in Warrior, Alabama on a small horse farm, assisting her father in shoeing horses as well as barrel racing and team roping. She graduated with a bachelor's from Berry College in 2012, her master's in 14, and a PhD in 17 in ruminant nutrition and reproductive physiology from North Dakota State University. She was hired in 17 as the state sheep and meat goat extension specialist for Kansas State University with a 70% extension and 30% teaching appointment. Allison dedicates her time to mentoring graduate students with a sheep and meat goat interest, conducting applied sheep and meat goat nutrition, reproduction, and management research, and providing information and education to sheep and meat goat producers around the state. So at this time, I will give Allison a chance to share her screen, and we can go from there.
Okay, I think we're on. Can everybody see it?
Yep, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, so today I was asked to talk to everyone about multi-species or co-species grazing. So mostly how to incorporate sheep and or goats into an existing cattle operation. So the first thing I always like to talk about are some of the terms that you commonly hear when we talk about co-species or multi-species grazing, because there's a lot of them out there, and people swear by some, and then there's some that are just cursed, it seems, but I always like to mention them. So continuous is what we would all commonly do. It doesn't really fit into a grazing management system just because it's continuous grazing. I'll touch on that more here in a second. And then when we get into actual grazing management systems, the first we talk about is controlled. And so controlled is when you're implementing any type of control in a system of grazing. And then within controlled, that's kind of where we branch out into many different grazing systems. One of the most popular, especially with small ruminants, is strip grazing. And that's where we'll split something, a pasture or a paddock, into smaller strips and then expand those strips and move those animals into a larger and larger area, just so we start out with a lot of grazing pressure and then move into less and less grazing pressure. And then, of course, we have co-species, which is where we would have two species grazing together, or multi-species grazing. And we typically describe that as 3 or more species of animals grazing either at the same time on the same pasture or like progressively through a pasture. Okay, so when we get into continuous grazing, this is kind of the easiest one to describe. So these pastures are going to be maintained through an entire season. So animals, like I said previously, are going to just stay in one paddock or one section. I tend to talk in paddocks. So, and we don't really move them. We might move them once if we see some really intensive grazing happening in certain spots. But most of the time we're just continuously grazing them through one paddock. In this instance, the goat, sheep, or cattle in some cases are making the decision. Whatever the livestock is, that's who's making that grazing decision. So wherever they want to graze, that's where they're going to graze. They're going to eat whatever they want. We're not applying any selection pressure as far as the forage is available. They also decide where to congregate, which can be a good thing, but it can also be a very bad thing if we have any runoff or certain areas where the soil is eroding. And it seems like that's always where they want to congregate and continue to the detriment of that soil. We also tend to see some overgrazing where there's preferential plants in an area. And then of course we'll have undergrazing in other areas. So sheep and goats especially like to stay up high. They like to graze high spots. So if you have hills, they tend to hit those hills a little bit harder. And so you'll see some overgrazing more on those hilltops rather than down low. And then they'll sometimes bed in those lower areas. Whenever we have some of these less preferred plants in a pasture, if we don't have our stocking density high enough in those pastures, we can't adjust as our conditions might or might not change in those areas. So forage availability in a continuous grazing system may not be ideal. Usually we're either going to run into a too high or too low of availability throughout a grazing season, depending on rain, the weather, and of course our stocking densities. And then the next thing is that temporary fences can be used to fence off portions of a pasture, especially if there are some of those grazes where maybe they're hitting too hard, or maybe you really want to confine them to a certain area that they just aren't wanting to apply any pressure to. We can use temporary fencing to fence off those portions in these grazing systems. Okay, and then we get into a controlled system. So controlled grazing, like I said, just means you're implementing some type of management system into your grazing season. When typically we're going to say that we're going to graze a paddock or a pasture for a very limited amount of time. Some people, it's as little as 2 to 3 days, depending on the size of the paddock and how much pressure they want on that paddock. Or it can be anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks that they're on a paddock. So it all depends on how you're wanting to implement that management and how you're wanting to manage that grazing. Typically, the rule of thumb is that we don't graze any more than down to 4 inches. You might hear 4 to 6 inches, but 4 is definitely the mark you don't want to go below. And of course, there's some grasses that are just naturally shorter. And there's some that we can't graze down to 4 inches. So if you saw on this previous slide, I have a list of a few forage species that really don't maintain well at below 6 to 8 inch height. But for the most part, about 4 to 6 inches tends to maintain those grasses pretty well, and especially here in Kansas. And there's a few reasons why we don't want to graze below that 4 to 6 inch mark. Number one is if we do have small ruminants, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here in a minute, but if we have small ruminant species, most of the larvae of the parasites that small ruminants get infected with, when they are ingested, it's usually at that 4 to 6 inch height. So once that larvae has hit its level 3 stage or a more mature stage where it's ready to be ingested into an animal so it can reach maturity, it has to crawl up to about a 4 inch height, but it can't crawl up more than that. So if we maintain our grasses higher than that 4 to 6 inch mark, we tend to protect our small ruminant animals more from that infection. The second reason, and I argue the most important reason as far as grazing management goes, is that most of our grasses don't have enough leaflets left when we get below 4 inches of height to undergo photosynthesis. So we want to make sure we're walking our pastures and keeping an eye on the grasses that we have in those pastures and making sure that we have leaflets on all the grasses so that they can continue to grow. If we don't have leaves on the individual grass blades, then they can't undergo photosynthesis to keep growing. The smaller the paddocks in these controlled systems, any type of controlled system, we typically see the more success with those. And that's just because we have increased grazing pressure. We can move the animals more often because we have more paddocks. And so we get less parasite infection. We allow those grasses in those first paddocks to reproduce and continue to grow and recover, and those animals continue to move on to the next one. I already said leave some leaves behind to allow for the recovery of those plants. And the biggest benefit of these controlled systems is that we can increase our plant diversity, which is especially important in our native grasslands here in Kansas. So when we talk about the uses of these controlled grazing systems, like I said, we can increase plant diversity, which leads to pasture improvement. We can extend the season of grazing, and also just overall improve the quality of forage available to whatever livestock we have on those pastures. And one of the biggest benefits for small ruminant producers is that we can reduce the parasite load when we're actually grazing correctly. Okay, so the first system I'm going to talk about is strip grazing. This is just because it's one of the most popular that we see. You can see kind of an example in that picture down on the right. These goats are in a type of strip grazing system, but this is within a controlled system. We can split them into a larger paddock and move them every 3 days, but usually we're grazing in narrow strips. And then you'll just move that temporary fence line to expand that strip over time. And that's going to allow a certain area to be focused on by the animal pretty heavily. And then, of course, as we expand that strip, they're going to continue to move themselves onto that newer grazing area, just because they're going to want that improved grazing. Typically, we're going to move these animals every 2 to 3 days, but of course, it depends on the size of the paddock and how much we can limit that area. And the biggest reason we do use these systems is because of the increased pasture utilization. It allows for recovery of the pasture, many of the things I just mentioned with controlled grazing. In these systems, we usually see increased average daily gains, gain per acre. And if you're ever going to use a nutritional flush on pasture, a lot of people use these strip grazing systems because we can rapidly increase body condition score in a very short amount of time. We're going to use this when the pastures are highly vegetative, so they're in their growth time of growth, and the vegetation is of high quality. These also ideally are used during cooler weather. And so anywhere we have stockpiled fescue in the late fall and early winter, these can be used with a lot of success. If we have low quality forage on a pasture though, especially with goats, they're going to tend to be too selective, and they will actually lose body condition score in those instances, and will get decreased average daily gains and probably none at all in most cases. Okay, so I like to do a compare and contrast of using controlled versus continuous grazing. So the positive impacts of utilizing a controlled grazing system is that we can utilize our pasture better. The animals are going to utilize the grasses better. During our seasons of fast growth, and if we have any excess forage, we can stockpile that forage, whether that's for more grazing or for a hay crop. And if we already have that fenced off, we can just not rotate the animals through those paddocks. And so it allows for that stockpile of forage. We can also stretch our forage availability and stretch our grazing season. And it also is going to force the consumption of those less palatable plants, which for sheep and goats is a great thing. But it also is going to improve pastures over time for cattle grazing if we're incorporating sheep or goats into those systems. The negative impact of these controlled systems is we have a higher upfront cost when implementing these systems. So we usually have to increase our fencing, even if that's a temporary fence system. It still costs money. Whenever we bring in sheep or goats into an area, especially if it's just been heavily grazed by cattle in the past, especially in the recent past, we tend to have a lot of predators in the area, and it's a good idea to implement guard dogs or some type of guard animal in that system, just to decrease loss on those pastures. We also can run into some unsatisfactory layouts. Sometimes we end up with a long, narrow paddock, just to try and avoid wet or dry areas, or if there's an area where we see that they're hitting way too hard, we need to be able to cut them off of that area. So sometimes that happens, and we just have to manage around that. We also have to be able to fluctuate our stocking rates, especially depending on the year. We can run into some overstocked pastures pretty quickly, especially if it's someone that's not used to being in these systems and they're not going out every couple of days to really keep an eye on those pastures. So that's something that we definitely want to avoid. And then on the other hand, in a good year, this has happened to us here recently, when we have a lot of grass available, we can run into our rest periods being way too long. And then when that happens, of course, our forage is going to become mature. It's going to lessen in nutritional value for the livestock, versus having that young vegetative growth, which is most of the reason why we implement these rotational grazing systems. And so we don't want to let those grasses rest for too long between grazing times. And then lastly, we can run into our pastures being dominated with low forage quality if we do any one of these factors, if we run into any one of these factors. But other repercussions that I also like to mention, and some of these can be construed as good or bad, is that we run into tamer animals. Just because they are being moved more often, they get to recognize whoever is managing them. They get to learn when they're going to be moved. And so we do see that they are tamer. They get more used to people, which can be good or bad. We also run into less waste of forage on pasture. There's less trampling of the forage. We get a more even urine or dung distribution. Of course, where they're bedding down, there's going to be a little bit more urine or dung in those areas. But for the most part, we get a much more even distribution just because they're up and grazing a lot more often, just because they know they're going to be moved. We also get increased observation of the animals, so we tend to get a higher detection of health issues, and overall just better management of those animals. Okay, so there's a lot of words on this slide, but I do like to highlight the differences in feeding behavior amongst cattle and sheep and goats, and how when we are out there every couple of days, really looking at how the different species are grazing, we really get to see the benefits of their different behaviors. So, and I have a little table that I'll show you here in a second too, that really highlights that. But we know that all three of these species, cattle, sheep, and goats, are going to utilize different feeds, different forages that are available to them. And of course, cattle tend to not like some of our invasive species of plants, like the wild honeysuckle and some of the wild dogwoods and Cerisa lespedeza especially. But a lot of these plants are higher in tannins, and sheep and goats actually tend to gravitate to those during certain times within the grazing season. And so when those plants are more naive and in their growth stage, sheep and goats tend to prefer them. And of course, cattle have a harder time grazing those, or we have a hard time making cattle graze those plants, if at all. So when considering what animal to incorporate into an existing cattle operation, sheep tend to be a lot more closely related to feeding behavior of cattle, but they are still going to be less picky, I say. And then they're going to target more of our forbs versus cattle. And then, of course, goats are going to tend to browse more, and they're the least picky of all. And I say this and with the note that boar goats tend to act less like a goat than other goats. So if you're thinking about incorporating goats into a cattle operation for grazing purposes or grass management purposes, I would steer people away from incorporating boar goats into that operation. And if anyone has any questions about that, feel free to ask. But when we talk about feeding behavior as well, multiple species grazing in a pasture is our best available tool for managing the forages we have available. Most studies have indicated that we see greater production out of the animals. We see the better pasture utilization, as I've mentioned. And that's when we graze sheep and cattle together, or sheep, cattle, and goats all through a pasture, whether that's at the same time or split up. If we only graze one species at a time, we aren't putting as much selection pressure on that pasture, on those plants, but we still see some benefits from that as well. And the more diverse the plant population on that pasture, the more diverse our grazing species need to be to get that higher pasture utilization. I'm going to go ahead and move on. I don't want to run out of time, but we do see additional benefits with our parasite management. So gastrointestinal parasites, that's what that GI stands for. Most of the parasites we worry about in small ruminants cannot survive in cattle. And that's usually the biggest worry when cattle producers are wanting to incorporate sheep or goats into the operation. They're worried that we're going to contaminate cattle through these grazing systems. But in most cases, it's just not true. We actually can graze cattle in front of the sheep or goats to the detriment of parasites. The only time that we really worry about contaminating cattle with parasites from sheep and goats is in a young calf. They can be susceptible to the barber pole worm when they're very young and naive. So I always tell people, if you have calves on the side of a cow, it's probably a good idea to not graze following sheep or goats until you have those calves off the side of the cow. But otherwise, it's just not much of a concern. We can use many different strategies if people are a little apprehensive and grazing sheep and cattle together or goats and cattle together. In a field with a very low parasite load, I don't hesitate to graze all the animals together. Or if we have cattle that are in late gestation, I always say graze them through the pasture first, and then let the sheep or the goats follow in behind. And that's just because those cows are in their highest time of requirements, nutritional requirements. They should get first pick on that pasture of what they want to eat and get that highest nutrition available, and then move on to the next pasture, and then just have the sheep or goats following up. Now, if it's vice versa, I would say put the sheep or the goats through first, of course, and then follow them up behind the cattle. And the nice thing about that is if the cattle ingest any of those parasites, they're a dead end for those parasites. So when we have the sheep or goats rotate back through first, we're going to have less of a parasite load on that pasture. Okay, so this is that table I was talking about. On that left-hand side, we have the different livestock species, but we also include deer in this table. And then we have the different diet types. So grasses, the broadleafs and legumes, and then the browse in that right-hand column. So I just show this to people just to explain the differences, but also the similarities or crossovers in some of these different species diets. So I always like to point out that goats and white-tailed deer actually have a relatively similar diet. Now, the goats are going to tend to eat less of the forbs than white-tailed deer, but they actually have a lot of overlap in browsing. And I purposely put this picture down in that bottom left-hand corner so that you can see. And I should have put some videos in here of goats just pushing down small sapling trees and just stripping the leaves off of them. And if you have problems with cedars, goats will actually strip down a cedar and can kill a cedar tree if it's less than about 3.5 feet high, is the general rule there. So goats can be great at managing some of these invasive woody species of plants that we have in Kansas. Now the sheep are going to, like I said, tend to eat a lot more of the forbs. They're going to have much more crossover with cattle, but we still can run them with cattle, alongside cattle, and they're going to just be pressured to eat more of those forbs rather than competing with cattle. So I think there's a great benefit of grazing both sheep and goats with cattle, but especially the goats in most of our pastures in Kansas. Okay, so other things to consider, I think I mentioned some of these, but these are really the big takeaways from this. But align your nutrition that's available on pasture during the grazing season with the stage of production of the species you're utilizing. So like I said, if you have something that is in late gestation, they're definitely, you're going to want to give them preferential grazing, and then grazing the other species in behind them, or putting them all in at the same time, so that we get better pasture utilization and better grazing selection pressure. Be aware of your stocking rates if you're going to implement one of these systems through multi-species grazing, and be willing to change your stocking rates and adjust those as need be. The other thing is predator control. We definitely need predator control in most areas of Kansas. I tend to go to the guard dog side of predator control. They tend to be the best thing we have available, but we can also use llamas, alpacas, and donkeys as well. And then fencing. So most of our fencing for cattle is not going to keep goats in. We likely are going to have to put in some type of new fencing system when we incorporate goats into a cattle operation, unless there's plenty of feed on the inside of that fence. And still you're going to have a few that find their way out, but they're more than likely going to come back through that fence. So that's another thing to think about. Now with wool sheep, if we're incorporating wool sheep into a cattle operation, usually in some instances, depending on the bottom strand height, a 5-strand barbed wire fence can be sufficient to keep wool sheep in. And at most, you're going to have to run a bottom wire and make it a 6-strand barbed wire fence. Some of the hair sheep, if they're bigger hair sheep, can be the same or similar to the wool sheep. But in most cases, you're going to have to run that 6-strand across the bottom. In general, wherever we run 1 head of cattle, we can run 5 head of sheep and 6 head of goats. And that's why in these systems, we can see increased stocking rates by about 25%. And that's just through pasture improvement, increased pasture utilization, and of course, diversifying the species that we have available to us are always a benefit. And then now I just have some pictures of different grazing systems that have been used throughout time in research. This is actually in North Dakota, where we had some leafy spurge issues and sheep were used in these systems. So that top left picture, you can see the leafy spurge on one side. They were getting to where they couldn't even put cattle in that area because cattle wouldn't need the leafy spurge. So they started grazing sheep in those areas. And within 2 years, they pretty much had the leafy spurge gone in those paddocks. And then this other picture just shows the pasture that was grazed by sheep versus not grazed by sheep and the difference that makes. And of course, we know goats can be great at clearing underbrush, and many systems right now, they're being used to clear out a lot of this brush that could start some of our wildfires. So these are some slides actually from Shane Tiffany, where he was bringing in some hair sheep into his cattle operation, the grazing side of things, just for some pasture improvement. So he's been doing this for a few years now. So I'll just quickly kind of go through these. But he was, this is the guard dog he had out with them. His kids loved this guard dog. So, and he did a really good job at protecting those hair sheep. But these are just some little videos. This first one that I'm going to play shows what this area looked like before they put the sheep in. So the cattle were not walking through this. It was really overgrown, as you can see. But there's a lot of green there. And so he wanted to see if he could get this cleared out, but he didn't want to do it by hand. Go ahead and start this other one. And this is after that first grazing season, just a few months of having sheep in there. So you can actually see through parts of it now, and they definitely cleared out the underbrush. And he said his #1 complaint was he just should have had more sheep in there. But they definitely did a good job of clearing it out. And that's just continued to improve over the last few years that he's been doing this. So you can see throughout the grazing season, these are just some pictures of the improvement of having sheep in there. And he included this picture just to show that green pastures where the sheep have been versus where those cattle are, and just improved throughout one grazing season. And pretty sure that he still says now that he has enjoyed having those sheep in there throughout these last few years to improve those pastures. Okay, I think that's all I have. So if someone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Alison, I actually have a few questions because Ottawa County and Swain County, their sheep and goat production, or just the idea of using them for pasture management, has increased since I've been here. So I get a lot of questions on these type of things. So the main question I get from people is deciding between sheep and goats and which one to use. So I guess maybe I'm not asking you which one you think they should pick, but what are some things that they should consider when they go to decide whether they want to use sheep and goats for specifically? I mainly get it for like pasture management, weed and brush control. So kind of focus on that maybe a little bit.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing to consider is how much labor and cost up front you're willing to take on. Because like I said, with if you incorporate goats, and I'm going to follow this up with a comment too, but if you incorporate goats into a grazing system, you're going to have a higher upfront cost, because you're going to have to improve fences more. And there's going to be some more labor there as well. But I think the greatest benefit comes from the goats. And this is coming, I am a sheep person more than I am a goat person. So it kills me a little bit to say, but the goats are going to do a much better job with brush control, brush management. And they're going to put more pressure on more quickly. And so, that's what the comment I made to Shane with these pictures, like you really should have had sheep and goats in there. Because the goats would have just decimated those areas where he had all that browse, which is what he wanted. So he would have seen more results more quickly. But with that comes more management. And that's why he didn't get the goats, because he wanted something he could just turn out, and it was going to be almost exactly the same as having the cattle out there. And that's where you see more people incorporating sheep into a cattle operation rather than the goats. And the sheep will eventually have a very similar effect, if not the same effect as the goats on a pasture. It's just going to take them longer to get those results with the sheep. And you're not going to have that fencing improvement in most cases. With Shane, he just ran a bottom wire on these fences to improve those fences for the sheep. So, and you don't really even notice the dogs out there. You might go feed them and check on them every few days. But most of the time they don't really even eat the dog food. So it's really not that much of a hassle to even have the dogs. So I don't know if that covers most of it, but
Yes, it does. So, and I actually see more goats in Ottawa County and sheep in Saline
really?
County. And so I've had a couple questions on what type of goats, and I know or what breed, and I know you said boar was probably not your suggestion.
Yeah.
Can you touch on maybe a little bit more on why boar is not your suggestion, and then what you would suggest as maybe like your top breed that you think, or something that works well?
Yeah. So most people are going to go to the boar just because that's what they're familiar with and that's what they've seen. And boars are a great goat. So no one crucify me. Boars are great. But they've been selected for growth. And with that, we have selected them to be less and less like a goat, and especially in their behavior. So you will see some boar goats that will browse and be pretty aggressive in the browsing. But by and large, they will graze when given the opportunity, versus a lot of other goat breeds that they don't want to graze, they want to browse. And so one of the best breeds out there is the Spanish goats. That's a breed that you can turn out, and they are very hardy, and they do a great job at just attacking forage. And then if someone's still wanting to stick to more of a classical meat goat, I would say the Kiko would be the way to go. But if they're using them for grazing management predominantly, I would stick to the Spanish type goat.
I think you touched on everything that I have. If anybody else has any questions, here we go. We have one. Are there special considerations to adapting mixed species grazing in drought-prone areas where forage availability is more variable from year to year?
Yeah, so that's what makes it tough, is when we have those dry years or just dry areas. So the main thing is you have to be willing to let your stocking rates fluctuate. You have to be willing to adjust that. And I'm gonna say this too. If we have those hardier type goats, they're gonna handle that better. than a lot of our sheep breeds will. So if we have sheep breeds like what you saw in these pictures, the Easy Cares, they do a really nice job of maintaining body condition with less feed. So you're gonna have to worry about breeds like that less. Same with like the Spanish goats. They're gonna handle that drought stress a lot better. Same as cattle, you know, there's some breeds that handle that a lot better than others. But the biggest thing is that we're willing to cut our numbers down, the stocking rates down, when we have those drier years. And I'll say this too, we can also give them a little bit of supplementation on pasture during those years, especially if we don't want to cut our stocking rates by as much as we might need to. And some of that supplementation can help too. And I know that kind of defeats the purpose a little bit of what you would be doing in a grazing management system, but some years you just have to do it.
Allison, I do have one. This is Clinton. In that situation with Shane, Tiffany, was that just goats on that, or sheep, I'm sorry, on that grazing situation, or were there cattle there as well?
Yeah, so in a lot of his situations, because I only have the pictures from that one year, but in a lot of his situations, he was grazing the sheep behind the cattle. And and I think in a few of his paddocks, he was grazing them together. And so, did you have another question about that?
Not necessarily. I didn't know if they were together or if you'd have a recommendation, on an ideal.
Yeah. So I can tell you from another producer's perspective. So I don't know if y'all know Joseph Hubbard, Shannon Creek lamb. He's been bringing in a lot of wool sheep, and he grazes them alongside the cattle. So they're not separate until it comes time for lambing. And the nice thing about doing that is that the sheep and goats will do this too, but in about 2 weeks of being together, they will bond. And so Joseph actually doesn't have a guard animal out with those sheep. So that's the really nice thing is you might lose. I mean, I think his first group he had about 550 head of sheep out with cattle. And the first couple of weeks, they were staying pretty separate. And then he lost about 5-6 head of sheep in the first 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden the sheep just stuck with the cattle because they learned, hey, if we bed down with these cattle at night and stick close to them during the day, we're not going to get eaten by coyotes. So, and then now he says every year when he turns them back out for grazing, they're bonded right together. And he even has videos of them coming. You can follow him on Facebook, and he posts a lot of these videos. But he has videos of just putting him into another pasture, and the sheep and the cattle are coming through the gates together. They don't separate or anything. So they will bond, and the cattle will protect the sheep.
Alison, we have another question. What is the best woven wire fence for goats?
So I'm a big fan of, and I just blanked on that name. Oh, the Stay Tough fence. It's expensive. I think it's the most expensive fencing out there. But that's what we have up at the unit. And that's actually what one of the other units just put up because they're thinking about incorporating some goats into their grazing. And I really think it's the best stuff out there. And I think it's worth the money in the long run. But if you're going to go with some of this, I definitely say get the smaller squares. The smaller the squares, the better in your woven wire fence. Because I know a lot of people just don't want to buy the Stay Tough because it's expensive. And you can always put some hot wires across the bottom of it. And then depending on the height, maybe one across the top. I've seen a lot of that. But the biggest thing is when you're going to use that hot wire, make sure it's hot. So you don't want them learning that it's not. But that's my recommendations with those. But the reason I say the smaller squares is getting heads stuck. Goats are magicians. So that's my biggest recommendation there.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat box, but if you do have questions later, you can email any of the agents on the screen, or even Clint, he put his email up later. So if you have questions or you're watching this recording at a later time, feel free to do that. And I think we have Allison stop sharing her screen so we can put up the.
There we go. And
Okay, I'll take a second to just thank everybody for joining us today. Just a reminder, our series will continue next week on December 16th. Dr. Greg Hanslechek will be discussing early cow-calf health. So be sure to join us again at 10 a.m. We also want to remind everyone of the survey, the evaluation. If you could take some time to complete that, we'd really appreciate it. So thanks again.
Thank you, guys.
yeah, thanks, Doc.